Thank you, Lois, and thanks everyone for coming along tonight. As Lois mentioned, I've been researching the lives of German Australians during the Second World War and also the post-war period. This has been supported by the generous bequest of the Vera family. This is a topic I've been drawn to after spending many years thinking about my own family's history and trying to position it in relation to the wider collective memory of war history in Australia. It crystallised as an idea for me a few years ago when I was working for the Victorian State Government on a commemorative project researching the lives of Australian men and women who had served in Victoria from the First World War right up to the Iraq War. At one point, an elderly woman approached me and she asked, "What is a girl with a German surname doing researching the history of our Anzacs?" It was a pretty funny experience at the time, but I guess it reminded me of how disconnected my family's war story is from Australia's Anzac tradition. It's a story that doesn't venture into the theatres of the Second World War that strike a chord with most other Australians, Kokoda, Tobruk or Changi. It's a story that begins in the middle-class suburbs of 1920s Melbourne and ends in the deep snowdrifts of Poland, 1945. To set the scene of the script you'll hear tonight, I wanted to give you some background of the three lives that form the centrepiece of the story. My grandparents, Joachim and Muriel Muhlen-Schulte, and their friend Vera as they lived between Australia and Nazi Germany in the years from 1938 to 1948. Their beliefs, experiences and actions are not something that fits within what is often heard as the cliched narrative of the Second World War as a fight between democracy and fascism. Without trying to offer any kind of apologist view of why some of them supported the Nazi Party, I was drawn to examining the records they left behind to understand their experience and what they don't want to talk about or can't talk about in their later years and reflections. My grandfather came from Berlin to Melbourne in 1928 as a young X-ray engineer. His name, Joachim, was shortened by Australians to Achim and then to Bob. He arrived at a strange point in Australian-German relations. Just a few years earlier, the Enemy Aliens Act prohibited Australia's former First World War enemies, Turks, Austrians, Hungarians, Bulgarians and Germans, from entering the country. They were classed in the same category as epileptics, idiots and criminals. But by 1925, restrictions on immigration had eased, and the wave of anti-German sentiment that had swept through Australia during the First World War retreated, shifting the landscape in its wake. Towns with German names had been anglicised, the threat of German colonial expansion into the Pacific had waned, and diplomatic ties began to thaw. With the rise of Hitler in 1933, there was even optimism in some Australian press reports that the Nazi Party would repair international relations and act as a kind of bulwark against the rising threat of communism. Surveillance records in the National Australian Archive document the establishment of Nazi Party bases within Australia, but only a handful of official members are really recorded, while unofficially there were many more supporters through affiliated sports clubs, social clubs, and some who were perhaps drawn unwittingly into the movement. Australian German propaganda publications circulated like Der Brücke, the bridge, which were filled with values that were seen to define the true German identity. I couldn't find Achim in any of the records of the National Australian Archive other than his immigration records, but I have found photos of holiday picnics in what may be Healesville in the early 30s, where the swastika flag flies high and my grandparents are among the party, including my grandmother giving the Nazi salute in the Australian countryside. There seems little doubt to me that Achim's family back in Berlin supported the Nazi Party, but perhaps another compelling angle for me in this story is the unusual alliance of an Anglo-Irish girl from Toorak, Melbourne, marrying an enemy alien. Muriel was 18 years old when she met Achim. Her memoir, written over 60 years later, is held here in the State Library manuscripts. Written on lavender paper, it comes across as a coming-of-age adventure mixed with a kind of Mills and Boon story. She also strangely writes about herself in the third person. In this excerpt, she recounts her first meeting with Achim. It was during February 1926 that a tall, slim girl who had just had her 18th birthday knocked on the door of the Gloria Light Company, Collins Street, Melbourne. It was immediately opened by a tall, blonde young man with dark brown eyes who was evidently on the way out. He held the door open for her to enter, then he went on his way. But in that moment he said to himself, "That is the girl I'm going to marry." This early description was the first hint that my grandmother is an entirely unreliable narrator. The photos I've seen of Achim always show him with a distinctly brown crop of hair, but Muriel's description tends to add a whole golden tinge to their first encounter. Even Muriel's surrender of her British citizenship, a legal requirement when marrying an enemy alien, is breezily recounted. She claims it was published in the Melbourne Sun as a headline as "Australian Girl Weds German" because it was such an unusual event in Melbourne. But despite searches through Trove, I couldn't find any reference to it. What I did unearth were entries in Australia's social pages that revel in the frivolity of a Melbourne girl abroad. Here you can see her telling everyone that Berlin is a woman's paradise of hats, and that she wasn't very impressed meeting Einstein because he wasn't very social. I think also what you find in her memoir is her glossing over dates to explain away their reasons for returning to Nazi Germany in 1938. The threat of internment in Australia for Achim may have been a fear, except camps for Germans and Japanese were not really established out into Tura in Victoria until 1940. According to Muriel's story, Achim had been offered a position in an X-ray firm in Buenos Aires, and they went via Germany to farewell Achim's family. In the dramatic twist of Muriel's memoir, the Santa Rosa was to sail from Germany on the 3rd of September 1938, but because Germany declared war the very same day, they were trapped and the ship sailed without them. Of course, the glaring detail she fails to notice or deliberately glosses over is that her dates precede the outbreak of war by a whole year. And the ship, the Santa Rosa, was an American passenger ship that never sailed from Germany to South America. Muriel's account of the reason they stayed in Berlin is entirely unreliable. I had to turn to Achim's letters, also held here in the manuscripts collection, along with their friend Vera Bockman, to piece together the next part of their lives in Berlin during the war, something you'll hear more of in the script. Vera Bockman's background was as a woman called Vera Hoffman from an established Australian German family in South Australia. She went on to marry a German national, Otto Bockman, and she also wrote a memoir called Full Circle, An Australian in Berlin, 1930 to 1946. It's interesting to read alongside Muriel's account to see where their memory aligns, contradicts, and diverges from one another. Vera is much more critical of the Third Reich. She describes the ominous atmosphere in Berlin during the early 1930s, but she neither fully examines Otto's beliefs or why they wanted to stay in Berlin rather than Australia. It is this wrestle between history and memory that draws me to these sources. The fallibility of memory is threaded through both women's memoirs, and Achim's letters specifically are framed from Muriel's eyes only. It's fascinating to explore how and why these individuals construct these accounts in retrospect or edit the events they witness. Part of this construction is the relationship these individuals go on to have with the bigger collective memory of war, which either reinforces their story or tends to set it off balance. As Inge Clendinnen describes, our memories are essential, our memories are unreliable. Most of us live with that discomforting paradox. But the serious and social political problems begin when stories cease to be personal possessions and come to be owned by a collective. Collective memories have many uses, only some of them benign. They might hold a beleaguered group together in the face of persecution, or keep a vision of a better future in the face of a dreadful present. Or they might sanctify convenient customs to prolong corrupt rule or throttle debate. Not much has been written about the collective memory of German migrants in post-war Australia, or women like Vera and Muriel who married the enemy. But some of the broader debates about collective memory in post-war Germany have been a useful frame of reference. From the 1950s to the 1990s, generations of Germans shifted between denial, confrontation, and victimisation in the ways in which they publicly talked about and commemorated the Nazi past. Achim, Muriel and Vera and others outside of my family I've explored did not experience this reckoning of Germany as a nation. While they share some of the characteristics or patterns that German collective memory moved through, their migration or return to settle in an allied nation placed them in limbo. They moved between continents and wrestled with their memories in post-war Australia. Their accounts are punctuated by silence, elisions, and a desire to assimilate their stories back into Australian culture. This community in Melbourne was a complex mix of Holocaust survivors, former German internees from Tatura, and even Nazi war criminals who had slipped through undetected, under a Menzies government far more concerned about tracing communist sympathisers. In the following generations, these families intermarried. My father, for instance, married a Jewish woman whose parents had fled Vienna, and they became friends with families who'd been split apart by internment in Australia. Some historians back in Germany believe that the rise of family memory and its place has the danger to represent the triumph of the private over the public, of emotion over enlightenment, and of uncritical empathy over pedagogy. I'm acutely aware of the danger of uncritical empathy when examining the lives of these German Australians, and particularly my own family, and I'm acutely aware of the limitations of empathy itself. How much do I really have in common with them as a descendant? What do I really understand or know about how they viewed Nazi Germany? My moral revulsion of the Holocaust makes it hard to understand the actions and the choices that my grandparents had. An important way for me to critique these memory sources was comparing them against public records from newspapers in Australia from 1928 to 1948, tracing in the National Archives the dates that Muriel and Achim actually left and arrived in Australia, contacting the German Red Cross for details of Achim's army records, and also corresponding with archivists in Berlin in an attempt to find details of Achim's X-ray firm. This was unsuccessful as the firm was bombed out in 1944. I've also hired a translator to transcribe oral history interviews and the German Red Cross documents. It's a process that's become reiterative, going back and rereading, re-listening, questioning their accounts and motives. And perhaps my biggest challenge in this is that I can't speak or read German. And yet for me, in a way, this is another theme through which to read these sources. It's a personal reckoning of this history for me as part of the younger generation. How do you articulate your family history when your forebears have assimilated their identity and language? And how do you choose to tell their story in a new homeland that didn't force them to confront the past? As I mentioned earlier, I think silence is a dominant theme throughout their accounts. I've found exploring this historical material a fascinating insight into how individuals wrestle with their memory and experience of Nazi Germany. I hope the script you hear tonight highlights some of the complexity of people's actions in wartime and how they're not simply black or white. While not always understanding them, perhaps we can still analyse the ways in which these individuals want to be remembered outside the collective or political context they live through. So where we're going to pick up from is Muriel and Vera moving to Germany in 1938. Both Muriel and Vera record in their memoirs how they left Australia for Germany in the early 1930s, and both say it was because of their respective husbands' job prospects in Berlin. Vera's husband Otto worked for a radio equipment firm, De Begg, and Achim worked for the X-ray firm Sanitas. Neither reflect on Achim or Otto's political views. The economic stability brought about by the Nazi Party created a level of material comfort that silenced and insulated many middle-class Germans from questioning the unpalatable and anti-Semitic policies of the Nazis. But there were scenes in the street that could not be ignored. Vera and Muriel were in Berlin when the boycott and violence against Jewish business owners culminated in the pogrom of Kristallnacht in November 1938. Vera witnessed the wholesale destruction of a boulevard near her house.
By lunchtime, the greater part of the devastation had been completed, the looting accomplished. But after school, the Hitler Youth still found things to do. What I noted most of all was the shocked and stunned look on people's faces. This had been the elegant Kurfürstendamm, their beloved boulevard, and now, what was happening?
Muriel, however, makes no mention of Kristallnacht, even though she is there at the same time. There is only one reference to the persecution of the Jews in her whole memoir. It's an extremely odd passage that is abruptly inserted after the description about her second pregnancy.
At this time, I was expecting our second child. For this reason, I received a card stating that I could not stand in queues and received other concessions as regards rations. Only once did I ever see Achim cry. That was when he came back from Poland with news of the ill treatment of the Jews by his countrymen. He could not grasp it. He was depressed for days.
There's something quite self-conscious about this memory. I think it's because when Muriel wrote her memoir in 1989, the full horror of the Holocaust was clearly exposed, and she was living alongside survivors in South Melbourne, suburbs of St Kilda, Toorak and Caulfield. However, there are other accounts of my family's struggle to understand the persecution of the Jewish community who they had worked with and lived alongside in Berlin. My brother interviewed Hilda Albrecht, the family housekeeper, in 1994. Hilda had lived with the family from the 1930s to the 1960s. She remembered Achim's father, Georg Muhlen-Schulte, and his reaction to Kristallnacht.
Und so weiter, ne? Denn das waren größtenteils waren diese Sachen in jüdischen Händen, ne?
Und wie hat man gespürt den Eindruck von Hitler gegen die Juden? Weil irgendwann kam es an...
Ja, das war dann ganz plötzlich. Also das kam ganz überraschend. Die Kristallnacht, ne? Hier in Berlin. Das war plötzlich. Opa ist in die Stadt gefahren und hat, also da wohnten wir ja noch in Tempelhof, ne? Und ich weiß, dass er in die Stadt gefahren ist und ganz entsetzt wiederkam, also das hat er nicht verstanden, nein.
Was hat er davon gesagt?
Naja, er hat nicht über Politik dann nicht sehr viel gesprochen.
Nachher.
The role of ordinary Germans who witnessed these events and their passive response is still something hotly contested. Numerous historical works probe this question. For many years after the war, the phrase, "we didn't know about it," became a popular German response to questions about the Holocaust. On a smaller scale, my family has also asked these questions of Achim and Muriel. What did they know? How much of the Nazi regime did they buy into? Muriel describes encounters with Gestapo as misunderstandings that were smoothed out in a friendly manner over coffee. But the Nazi state inevitably caught up with Muriel and Achim. They were evacuated from Berlin to escape the bombing, and Achim continued to work with Sanitas in the northeastern border of France, then occupied by Germany. With the approach of Allied forces, Achim's staff at the X-ray firm begged to be evacuated, which he agreed to, helping them to leave by train. This did not go unnoticed by the company accountant who reported Achim to the local Nazi group leader. Dismissing workers was an affront to the Nazi economic policy during the war. As punishment, Achim was dispatched for military service in September 1944. 1 month later, Hitler dispatched all men aged 13 to 60 years old into a people's militia in a last-ditch attempt to defend Germany's borders besieged by the approaching Allied and Soviet forces.
September 9th, 1944. My own dearest heart, it was the hardest thing in the world to leave you there in tears in a strange city with no home to go back to. This is the first real parting we've had since we were married. The first time that I have to leave you entirely to your own resources without being able to help in any way. But I believe you'll stick it out and fight your way through, if not for your own sake, then at least for the sake of our kiddies and for me. I'm now a tiny cog in a machine which rolls on in an inexorable rhythm, and I've just got to keep on moving round in this narrow, rigid path provided for me, without the slightest deviation of my own free will allowed. I kiss you tenderly on both eyes. May they brighten up too. A big hug for our sweet kiddies. With all my love, your own husband and Fati.
But the strain took its toll on Muriel, and she was angry with Akim about their situation. The last-minute evacuation from their home left her stranded with meagre food supplies and amidst approaching Allied forces. Akim sewed money into her hat and told her to get as close to the Swiss border as possible. After she'd found a farmhouse to board with her children, she left them to make a journey back to their old apartment back in France and collect what belongings she could find.
The few trains running were overcrowded. Sometimes they ran through the night, but timetables were erratic, and it meant long waits on railway stations. I managed to reach our apartment and collect a few of their valuable belongings. I noted wryly that the French landlord and his wife had removed most of our things to their apartment. With a few full bags, I stood on the road outside, wondering how I could get back to the railway station when a military truck with 2 German soldiers asked if I wanted a lift. I gladly accepted, but was also cautious in speaking to the young men, fearing they might detect my English accent and perhaps take me for a spy. All of a sudden, one of the soldiers said, "You speak just like my English teacher did at school." I had to reply honestly, "Yes, I'm an Australian, married to a German who has just been called up for military training." But they commiserated with me and drove me to the nearest railway station in a most friendly manner. That, in the middle of a war against England.
Muriel's memoir doesn't describe how she coped without Akim. From Akim's letters, it's obvious that Muriel did not share his optimistic view of the war's end. She continued to struggle with Nazi officials in the countryside who scrutinised the absurd details of daily life. Akim rebukes Muriel and appeals to her Britishness in an attempt to rouse her.
15 November 1944. My own sweetheart, the depressing mood in which you write is a great worry to me. For the first 5 years of this war, we've had a better life than most people. Now we've got to put up with what others have had to go through years ago and ever since. You've got to stop complaining and feeling sorry for yourself. Where is your British sense of humour, which is supposed to carry your race through even the most awkward and unpleasant situations? Has it really evaporated under the stress of the last couple of months? Then I could only hope that your compatriots across the Channel are equally near to giving up the ghost. When we said goodbye that last Sunday, you promised me you'd never fail me, that come what may, you'd never cease working and striving to bring us all together again so that we can rebuild our life together. That promise was a more important and solemn pledge than our marriage vows. It meant that I would never have to give up hope, no matter what might happen to me on the front. Don't you realise that only the thought of you and the kiddies and the hope of being reunited with you when all this mess is over makes me grin and bear it even now? The little pinpricks of daily life with strange people seem to assume colossal importance in your mind. You told me the little story of Michael doing a wee on the Bowers' pet cabbages and how the Bowers reported it to the Ortsgruppenleiter. And you concluded with the question, "And you think life is still worth living?" Expecting me to answer in the negative, I suppose, and to take my rifle, shoot myself in the backyard here, and in my farewell letter ask you to jump into the Bodensee. Surely you must admit your perspectives are all distorted, and what you write is sheer bunkum. Sweetheart, I'm sorry I had to rouse you up again once more, but I simply can't let you go on like that. And don't write me off already. I don't intend to let the Bolshies get me.
Muriel's also critical about Akim taking food from Polish civilians. Contrary to earlier descriptions of friendly relations, Akim mentions using the German army uniform and rifle to intimidate farmers into surrendering food such as chickens, fowls, milk and potatoes.
15 November 1944. Oh, but I must answer one more point in your letter. Apropos my telling you of what we have to do to supplement our rations, you imply that I'm going to the dogs in every possible way. That one really annoyed me. I'm not going to the dogs, and I don't intend to, not in any way at all. If we have to solve the food problem here in a somewhat unorthodox way, it's because it's the only way possible. It doesn't mean that I'll go on pinching potatoes for the rest of my life instead of buying them.
There's a kinder tone in the following letters which suggests that Muriel and Akim forgive each other and take stock of the deteriorating situation. While Muriel continued life on a farm near Switzerland, largely insulated from the worst parts of the concluding war, Achim was moved closer to the actual fighting. From June 1944, 2 million Soviet troops with thousands of tanks had advanced from Russia, breaking the German lines and rolling into Poland. As they came through Eastern Europe, they uncovered proof of Nazi atrocities. Extermination and concentration camps were exposed as the German army, SS, and Nazi-controlled police units retreated west.
Sunday, 24 December 1944. All this week, I didn't have a minute to continue the letter. It was the last week of our training, and they put the pressure on properly. The next day, we marched off at 2 p.m. with a full kit knapsack and for a 24-hour journey. We continued until about 9 p.m. The night was bitterly cold, and we stopped on a windswept field by the side of a river. We set off again, but first we had to cross the river. The hardest part was to get the horses and carts across. In all, it took an hour to get across. The night was clear and starless. The road, not a proper one, but rather like one of our Australian bush tracks, led through open scrub country, an isolated farm every now and then. At about 3 a.m, we approached our destination, but at the same time the road disappeared, lost itself in open, swampy meadows. I was too sleepy to continue writing last night. Now it is Christmas Day. Last night, after I had blown out the candle, I lay in bed smoking my last cigarette, and I thought of all our Christmas days together. The rollicking happy ones with your family in Australia and the Christmas with our Michael. It was a sweet thing to think back. I can't find words to tell you how I felt and what I felt. It hurts too much anyhow. And now we have to shield our hearts against a fresh trial. Another turning of the ways is reached. This morning it was announced that we are going to be moved to the front on the 27th. My apprenticeship as a soldier is over, and now comes the real test. Also for you, my darling.
On January 12th, 1945, the Soviet Vistula Oder offensive attacked the German army from Warsaw east along the Vistula River. German intelligence had estimated Soviet forces would outnumber them by 3 men to 1. In fact, the ratio was 5 Russian soldiers to every 1 German soldier.
11 January 1945. My own darling, yesterday I got your letters of the 23rd, 24th and 26th December. I was very upset to hear about Marika's accident. Of course you couldn't help it. You need placid, docile babies for large chairs, not daring, adventurous nips like ours have always been from their beginning. Oh, my poor sweetheart, you had such a doleful Christmas. In spite of your brave attempt to keep cheerful in your letter, I know that you felt as miserable as I did. You were worried that you can't send me as much as the other lads get. Sweetheart mine, for heaven's sake, I wouldn't dream of asking you to share your slender reserves with me. Yesterday we collected 5 chickens and 15 eggs. I could have howled at being unable to send any to you. I'm very worried about you having so little, and I ask you once more, very earnestly, to use your reserve stocks now. You need that extra for this winter. It'd be silly to hold on to anything until I come on leave, because when I come, I bring plenty with me. 12 January 1945. Dicke Luft, Ivan greift an.
The air is thick, Russians attacking.
Worked through the night, luggage is packed, heavy artillery fire, Stimmung gut.
Morale is good.
Oh, my love, always your own, Achim.
This letter, scrawled on a piece of lined paper, hole-punched in the left margin, is the last news from my grandfather, who was lost somewhere between the Polish towns of Kilcher and Glogau 3 months before the war ended. When I went through Achim's letters here in the manuscripts collection, there were passages marked with X's where he mentioned fellow soldiers. I wondered if Muriel had made these marks when she began her search for Achim.
All my endeavours by means of letters to Achim's comrades and to their families, visits to the United Nations in Switzerland, investigation in Munich, where soldiers' records are kept, also the very kind assistance from the Australian Foreign Affairs Office, failed to elicit any information as to Achim's fate. He was officially posted missing.
Last year I contacted the German Red Cross to see if there was any new information that had come to light. I received a letter politely explaining that it was unlikely any further trace would ever be found. He fades into the last description of the Red Cross report, which describes how men of his unit
met their death in the heavily snowed-in forested regions and while crossing the Palica River, without having even been noticed by their fellow soldiers close by.
Muriel waited another year in Germany and England after the war for news of Achim before returning to Australia in 1946. She was reunited with Vera in London as they waited for passage back to Australia. Vera's husband had not been conscripted and survived the war and the Red Army's entrance into Berlin. Though Muriel considered remarrying after the war without proof of Achim's death, it was considered bigamy. She did not receive the official Red Cross report on Achim's fate for another 27 years. As she grew older, she glorified Achim's memory. She would also recount strange stories, such as the plumber who came to her house in Melbourne, saw the portrait of Achim on the mantelpiece, and swore that he had been a prisoner of war camp with Achim in the Soviet Union. It was never clear to the family if these stories were actually true, but they were a reminder that Muriel remained haunted by Achim's disappearance. It's hard to depict an individual and reconstruct their experiences over 68 years later, especially if it's someone in your family like your grandfather. It's harder still to position the significance of his death among 30 million people who died on the Eastern Front during the Second World War. Just 3 days on the Eastern Front amounts to the entire casualty rate toll for Australian forces during the Second World War. This toll on the Eastern Front also represents mostly civilians and includes the majority of Holocaust sites, from concentration camps to pogroms, death marches and ghettos throughout Eastern Europe. During the 1960s, the seemingly endless word Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which means struggle to come to terms with the past, but also alternately to wrestle into submission, was added to the German vocabulary. Young Germans began to question their parents' actions during the Second World War, and a wave of writers, philosophers, and politicians examined Germany's guilt and the amends it should make. The complex history that Germany wrestles with as a nation still lingers on a personal level for my family today. My exploration of this history is just one of the attempts in my family to reconcile the story. 50 years after Achim disappeared, my dad, Michael, went to Poland to retrace his father's last footsteps. Dad was 7 years old when Achim went missing. He has very few memories of Achim. He remembers seeing his bandaged arms. Achim had thrown incendiary bombs off the roof of an apartment block in Berlin, but then fallen through and clung onto the smouldering rafters, burning his arms as he waited to be rescued. But in 1996, one of the coldest winters hit Europe since the Second World War. Dad caught a train through the southwestern part of Poland between Warsaw and Krakow. He sat on the train, staring intently out the window, trying to imagine the scale of the Vistula Oder offensive on the 12th of January 1945 along the river. The barren, flat landscape, obliterated by ice and snow, hid any landmarks from view, and the path of the rail obscured the distance between the locations. But Dad felt that this journey was the closest he got to finding his father, Achim. Thank you.